She walked onto the stage with the poised calm of someone used to scrutiny, but from the moment she opened her mouth, it was clear this wouldn't be the usual fluff-laced celebrity appearance. What started off as a routine guest spot took a sharp turn when she decided to forego the typical small talk and instead delivered a volley of pointed, emotionally charged remarks. Her demeanor was controlled, her accent as distinct as ever, but there was an edge in her voice. Measured, yes, but impossible to ignore. The audience, initially buzzing with the light energy of a late-night taping, quieted. It wasn't the kind of hush that precedes a punchline or a shocking reveal. It was the kind that creeps into a room when something unexpectedly real breaks through the manufactured polish. She began by referencing the media's obsession with her fashion choices, not in a self-deprecating way, as is often expected of public figures on these kinds of shows, but with an unmistakable disdain. She didn't smile. There was no wink, no suggestion of irony. She spoke as though she had waited years for the opportunity, and now that it was here, she wasn't going to waste it. Her criticisms were sharp, even poetic in a slightly chilly way. She questioned the nature of celebrity culture, suggesting that America is more interested in what shoes a woman wears than what she believes or endures. She pointed out the double standards, how women are expected to be graceful under pressure, smile through every insult, and pretend that their experiences don't shape them. She never raised her voice, but her words landed like glass shattering on marble, clean and sudden, impossible to sweep away unnoticed. At first, there were a few awkward chuckles from the audience, the kind people make when they're unsure, if they're watching a joke or a moment unraveling in real time. But the tension grew as it became clear that there were no punchlines coming. She wasn't playing along with the script, and her body language said as much. Legs crossed tightly, hands clasped in front of her like armor, eyes not darting to the crowd or the cue cards, but fixed with laser precision on whoever sat across from her. There was an eerie sort of confidence in her tone, the kind that comes from knowing that nothing else can be taken away. She spoke of being underestimated, misunderstood, and even mocked, and yet she did so without asking for pity. Instead, it was a challenge. She didn't want the audience's sympathy. She wanted them to sit in discomfort for a minute and really hear what she was saying. And they did, because it was impossible not to. What made the moment even more striking was how detached she remained from the usual need to charm. She wasn't there to be liked. She didn't try to make her opinions more palatable, didn't soften her points with humor or humility. Every sentence had weight, and she let each one linger for a beat longer than expected, like she was daring the room to interrupt her. Some people squirmed in their seats, others leaned in. A few clapped briefly, unsure whether it was appropriate. The camera panned across the studio audience, catching expressions of disbelief, intrigue, even admiration. But mostly, it caught confusion. No one quite knew what they were witnessing, and that was the power of it. Because here she was, not laughing, not smiling, not playing along, and it was riveting. It wasn't polished performance. It was confrontation wrapped in civility. And it worked. She didn't need to raise her voice to shift the energy in the room. She didn't need to shout to make her message land. Every word was calculated, every pause intentional. This wasn't chaos. It was control. And in that brief, unexpected monologue, she flipped the late-night format on its head. She came in with her own agenda and executed it with surgical precision. No giggles, no rehearsed anecdotes, no manufactured relatability. Just her, a chair, a spotlight, and the kind of silence that screams louder than applause. The tension in the room had reached an unmistakable pitch. It was the kind of silence that pulses, not out of serenity, but because everyone's trying to process what they're witnessing. The stage lights seemed suddenly colder, sharper, casting long shadows across a set that was supposed to feel warm and familiar. This was supposed to be a conversation, a bit of late-night banter, something for the audience to laugh at on their way to bed. Instead, it was rapidly turning into something else entirely. She didn't back down. Her tone remained steady, her posture unwavering. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Each comment, each tightly woven sentence, carried the weight of years spent watching narratives unfold without her input. She wasn't shouting, but she didn't have to. The way she spoke was enough to shift the balance of control, and it was clear that she had no intention of softening her edge. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't chaos. It was too controlled for that. But it was disruptive. Deliberately so. Across from her, the reaction was first bemusement, then confusion, and then a very clear flicker of concern. Things were veering far outside the usual lanes of celebrity interviews. This wasn't playful, wasn't charming, and certainly wasn't scripted. What had been expected was a safe, predictable conversation with a few cheeky moments, and maybe a carefully worded anecdote. Instead, what was happening was unpredictable and charged, and the atmosphere began to shift noticeably. The room, filled with professionals who had done this dance 1,000 times, suddenly felt like uncharted territory. There were a few glances exchanged off camera, small but unmistakable. A producer shifting in their seat, someone behind a camera adjusting their stance, as if subtly preparing for whatever might come next. There was no yelling, no breakdown, but there was a slow-building sense of friction, like something was grinding, just beneath the surface of civility. As she continued, the words became bolder. She started questioning the very foundation of the platform she was sitting on. Not by name, not explicitly, but the message was clear. She challenged the function of entertainment masquerading as discourse and called out the ways in which women like her were often framed, dissected, and ridiculed under the guise of humor. There was nothing abstract about it. It wasn't vague or philosophical. It was personal, even if she didn't say so directly. The discomfort in the room was palpable, growing thicker with each sentence. The audience had been primed for levity, for a carefully curated segment designed to make them laugh and clap on cue. Instead, they were being asked, no, forced, to listen to something raw and direct. She was dismantling the structure as she sat in it, calmly, but with visible conviction. And the person on the other side of that conversation didn't know how to react. There were attempts to shift the tone, to steer things back to a safer track. Light remarks, subtle interruptions, even a small joke thrown out like a life raft. But none of them landed. She didn't laugh. She didn't acknowledge the redirections. It was as if she'd decided that this time she wasn't going to be steered, that if this was the platform being offered, she would use it on her terms, completely and unapologetically. The balance had shifted. Whatever invisible contract exists between host and guest, the one that keeps things civil and digestible, had been torn up on the spot. There were no fireworks, no outbursts. But the refusal to conform to the expected rhythm was radical enough, and as it became clear that she wasn't going to play along, the air in the room turned from tense to outright uneasy. Eventually, it became apparent that the segment couldn't continue. Not because she was out of control, but because she wasn't controllable. There was no salvaging it in post-production, no clever edit that could turn it into entertainment. It was too direct, too heavy, too real. The usual tools, smiles, laughter, deflection, had no effect. They fell flat against her calm but unyielding presence. In that moment, the decision was made. Not explicitly, not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet finality. The conversation had crossed a line, not in volume but in intent, and there was no path back to the safety of rehearsed charm. The rules of engagement had been broken, and the result was a segment that would never air the way it was intended. There was no dramatic shouting match, no security sprinting across the stage with urgent gestures, no viral-worthy outburst. It was quieter than that. The shift began with something subtle, a producer's headset crackling to life, a brief glance, exchanged between crew members, and the kind of pause that stretches longer than anyone's comfortable admitting. She was still seated, her posture intact, expression unreadable, but the energy around her had shifted into something charged, not chaotic, controlled, yet unmistakably serious. The moment had gone too far off script, not in a scandalous or outrageous way, but in a way that made it clear she wasn't here to play the part expected of her. She wasn't angry, at least not visibly, but she wasn't backing down either. She sat still, her presence somehow louder than if she had stood up and walked out herself. That stillness, refined, pointed, was its own kind of rebellion. The handlers started to close in, not literally, but in movements. One assistant whispered to another. Someone walked briskly across the back of the set. Tension was thick in the space between the stage and the control room. The cameras kept rolling, but there was an air of indecision, the kind that makes everyone hyper-aware of their role and what could be on the line if they act too soon or too late. She wasn't yelling. There was no scandalous soundbite waiting to break out of her mouth. But her words had already crossed a threshold, the kind that production teams don't like. Not because they're offensive in the traditional sense, but because they're too sharp, too personal, too unfiltered. She had shifted from guest to disruptor, not in temperament but in truth. It wasn't a performance, and that made it dangerous. The quiet gestures multiplied. A nod from a producer, a crew member stepping into the camera's periphery under the guise of repositioning equipment. A signal was given, subtle, practiced, but unmistakable to anyone who knows how these shows really work. There was no alarm, just procedure. This kind of thing doesn't happen often, but when it does, the mechanisms move like clockwork. She noticed. How could she not? She watched it unfold with a steady gaze, giving nothing away. No panic, no surprise, just a look that said she had expected this, maybe even counted on it. Her final words were less fiery than everything that had come before. Calm, almost clinical, but they still landed like stone. Then came the pivot, not abrupt, not aggressive. A producer stepped forward gently. A staffer moved into place with practiced softness. It wasn't an escort in the traditional sense. It was a redirection, a transition designed to keep the audience comfortable, to reset the stage without drama. And she stood when asked. No resistance, no fight, just a quiet walk toward the wings flanked on both sides by people trying very hard to make it all look normal. But it wasn't normal. Everyone in the room knew that. The audience, which had spent the last several minutes, caught between fascination and discomfort, offered an uncertain smattering of applause, more out of reflex than genuine response. The crew didn't make eye contact. The lights dimmed just enough to signal a shift, and someone moved swiftly to cue up the next segment. What had just happened wasn't chaos. It was order breaking down under the weight of something it couldn't manage. There was no rule against what she said, no policy broken. But the unwritten code, that quiet agreement that guests come to entertain, not to challenge, had been violated. And once that line was crossed, there was no easy way back. The ideal removal wasn't punitive. It was precautionary. She hadn't disrupted the set with action, but with intention. She didn't get loud. She got real. And for a space designed to package difficult truths into digestible formats, that realism was too much. The stage wasn't built for it, so they made it stop, not with force, but with logistics. Not with confrontation, but with choreography. As she disappeared off stage, the team worked quickly to fill the space she left behind. The next guest was called. The music played. The audience laughed again, though not quite the same. Something had shifted. The machinery had kicked back into gear, but the system had felt the stress. And for a few fleeting minutes, someone had walked into that space and bent it out of shape just by refusing to play along. The moment she stepped off the stage, the reaction wasn't confined to the studio. In fact, the real show hadn't even started yet. Within minutes, clips were circulating online, not officially released footage, but shaky, grainy snippets, captured by audience members who knew they'd witnessed something unusual. The angle was off, the sound slightly distorted, but the internet didn't care. It had what it needed. Something raw, something unfiltered, something unexpected. People on social media reacted with the speed and intensity that only controversy can spark. Posts multiplied by the second, hashtags took off like wildfire, and armchair commentators from every political and cultural corner threw in their takes. Some hailed her as bold and fearless, someone who finally said what others were too scared to utter. They dissected every word, turned quotes into text graphics, and made her monologue into a symbol. She was reclaiming her voice, they said. She was refusing to be a caricature. Others were less forgiving. Critics accused her of being calculated, provocative for the sake of attention, or simply ungrateful for a platform she'd been given. They argued that what she said wasn't brave, just disruptive, and that her tone was unnecessarily cold, her delivery too practiced. Comment threads turned into battlegrounds, with thousands of people trading paragraphs of opinion, links to past interviews, screenshots, and memes. Especially memes. The internet doesn't just react, it remixes. Within hours, still frames from her appearance were turned into reaction images, sarcastic posts, and TikToks layered with audio commentary. Some were in support, casting her as a misunderstood icon. Others leaned into mockery, exaggerating her words or mimicking her accent in a tone-deaf attempt at humor. Her presence had gone from an unexpected moment on a late-night set to full-blown viral content, spliced, captioned, and shared by people who hadn't even seen the original clip. News outlets quickly followed. Headlines varied depending on the source. Some labeled the moment as controversial, others empowering, and a few leaned heavily into the spectacle, calling it a meltdown or a scene. Television segments devoted airtime to the incident, looping the same 20 seconds of her comments over and over with chirons that bordered on sensational. Pundits speculated about what it meant, politically, socially, culturally. What was she trying to say? Did she go too far, or not far enough? The layers of interpretation kept piling on. Commentators dug into past interviews, public appearances, even body language. Psychologists weighed in on her composure. Fashion critics debated whether her wardrobe choice that night had hidden meaning. Every frame of her presence was turned into analysis fodder. For some, it became clear she had pierced the illusion of what these appearances are supposed to be, controlled, pleasant, and ultimately forgettable. She had made herself unforgettable instead. Some of her defenders argued that this was the inevitable price of authenticity, that when someone, especially a woman with a complicated public narrative, refuses to play by the rules of likability, backlash is guaranteed. They said the moment proved that public platforms aren't really neutral spaces. They're curated, managed, and reactive to discomfort, and she had brought discomfort in full force. Those on the other side continued to argue that her words lacked grace, that they were too sharp, too accusatory. They criticized her for using a space meant for entertainment to deliver what they considered a grievance list. They said she had misunderstood the tone of the show, or worse, ignored it on purpose. In the chaos of the digital discourse, something else happened. People who hadn't paid attention to her in years were now talking about her nonstop. Younger audiences who had written her off as silent or aloof were suddenly reconsidering. For better or worse, she had broken through. The noise, the debates, the replays, it all pointed to one thing: she had refused to be forgettable. She had taken control of a space that wasn't designed for her kind of presence and turned it into a stage for something entirely different. The online world thrives on these moments, unscripted, uncomfortable, and ripe for interpretation. In her refusal to soften her words or adjust her tone, she had given the internet a moment it couldn't resist. Whether it was hailed as iconic or condemned as inappropriate, it was everywhere. And that, in today's media landscape, is its own kind of power. In the aftermath of the moment, once the stage lights dimmed and the cameras were turned off, what lingered wasn't the segment itself, but the disruption it caused. The conversation moved far beyond the walls of the studio. What might have been written off as a brief, awkward exchange became something larger, something reflective of the current cultural moment. It sparked debates about platforming, control, authenticity, and the cost of defiance in polished spaces. People weren't just talking about what she said. They were talking about why it mattered that she said it where she did, and in the way she chose. For years, she had been portrayed as reserved, elusive, almost ghost-like in her appearances. Her silence had often been read as complicity or indifference, but in those few minutes on that stage, she rewrote her image without needing permission. She didn't beg to be understood. She didn't soften her words to make herself more digestible. That alone challenged the script most public figures follow, especially women. Especially women who have spent their public lives being defined by association rather than by action. The moment was never going to please everyone. It wasn't designed to. That's what made it effective. She didn't show up to entertain or reassure. She didn't play into tropes or rehearse talking points for applause. Instead, she held her ground. That choice, subtle yet significant, broke through the usual performance of public life. It made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort was the point. What happened next? How quickly she was ushered off stage, how fast the internet lit up, how split the public became, proved just how tightly controlled these spaces really are. There's an unspoken rule. Keep it light, keep it fun, don't challenge the room you've been invited into. She broke that rule without apology, and in doing so, she forced a reckoning with the illusion of neutrality in entertainment. The fallout was loud. The images were replayed, analyzed, mocked, praised, weaponized. But underneath the noise, one thing was clear. She reminded everyone that even in the most controlled environments, a single voice, measured, intentional, and unafraid, can shift the room. Maybe not in the direction it was supposed to go, but toward something undeniably real. Whether she meant to spark a cultural flashpoint or simply reached her limit is still up for debate. But what's certain is this. For once, the story wasn't being told about her. It was hers to tell. And no matter how people tried to recut, reframe, or reduce it afterward, the original moment belonged to her. Unedited, unfiltered, and unforgettable.